You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Welcome back. We're here to talk about hidden contributors to neck pain. I think this will be a juicy episode. So many great contributing areas, and we talk in detail on the neck in our spine teacher training and specific ways to approach it, and detailing not only how to evaluate the tissues and range of motion here and function here, but also specific strategies to work with specific issues here. However, and that's a great resource if you're interested in working more with the neck and the rest of the spine, and you want really a deep dive into everything, the anatomy, the function, the evaluation, the approach to working with them. However, I think Rachel and I both find that there are often some hidden contributors. So not the go-to things that you think of first, but some other things that can be helpful, and I think can also fit really succinctly and nicely into a podcast as well. Well, and I think too, there are some mechanical issues here, like they might have disc herniations or stenosis or whiplash or something. And we do, again, we talk about those in depth in the training. However, what we're going to be talking about more is just generalized neck issues. So not necessarily specific to a diagnosis, but to just some really common things that we found to be helpful for neck issues as a broad general category.
The kind
because
that
we can't really
everybody
get more
has.
specific than that in a podcast.
Yeah.
And I feel like we all experience like lower back pain. I feel like neck pain is another one that is really common for most people to experience some form of it in their lifetime, whether that's severe or really short-lived or chronic, is going to be very variable to the person. But I think at very least, I think most of us at least experience a little tension, maybe a little stress. It's definitely a common place for stress. But I think a great place to begin is the obvious. And again, we're not really, for the sake of a podcast, going to be able to talk about a lot of specifics, but we'll talk really generally. I think the first step is a lot of times we do look at the neck itself, and are there stretches that can be helpful? And again, like you said, I think stretches are very limited in their capacity to help long term with most issues, because usually tight tissues aren't living in a bubble by themselves. Usually they're compensating for something that maybe isn't functioning the way that it should be, and there's usually more to the story than just stretching a tissue, usually. For a lot of reasons. But it could also be strengthening some of the tissues of the neck too. And especially, the deep neck flexors on the front get a lot of spotlight and attention for that in a lot of healthcare realms and physical therapy and whatnot. And, and we talk about it in our training as well. And so yes, we can look locally at the neck. There's some great stretches, for traps, and levator is often one that gets tight, or what are your favorites? SCM, scalenes?
Yeah. I always start with levator because but I think this is something that I learned from you in the shoulder training, actually, that people they kind of pile a lot of hate on the upper traps. Those poor upper traps get all of the bad press. But often the kind of nagging tension that we feel over the side of the neck and the top of the shoulder actually isn't from the upper traps. It's from levator scap, which joins the top inner corner of the shoulder blade to the base of the neck. And so this is my usual go-to if I'm looking stretching or myofascial.
And I think this is actually one we could probably speak to for those listening on the podcast. Some people might be watching the video on YouTube, but I think, an easy way too is to palpate and see, because both of these elevate the shoulder. So sometimes they can both be implicated. But if you just take your hand, so I'm taking my right hand over to my left shoulder, and you find that bony prominence going across the shoulder blade. So it's really the only bony prominence going across the upper back there, which is the spine of the scapula. Follow it medially toward the spine until you just fall off of the scapula there, and then go up about an inch and I'm just palpating. So imagine that the levator is going to go from that superior medial corner of the shoulder blades, that upper inner edge of the shoulder blade, up to the neck. So what I'm doing is taking and kind of cross fibering that tissue as I kind of rock back and forth to see right at that upper angle of the shoulder blade, is it the levator that's tender? Because if it's traps, it's usually more generalized. It's that
That
broad, bulky
meaty kind
tissue
of,
that
yeah, the
we're all
handful.
familiar with, the upper traps, right? You can kind of grab them and palpate them. They're also more superficial. So sometimes that can be one way to differentiate. I mean, obviously, it's pretty rudimentary. You're palpating just to see for tenderness, but that can be one way to see if it's levator. And I know you love levator because our MFR, it's one of our favorite MFR ones because it's the little disco move. For those of you who've done MFR training with us, the disco move to move the shoulder blade and the cervical spine as a way to create that shearing mechanism of the tissues that's so important for levator.
Yeah, I don't go to
Probably
many
some.
things as a kind of quick fix, but that's definitely one that, if not fixes the problem, definitely creates some temporary relief for a lot of people who think it's just this kind of nagging, it's like the side of the neck, the top of the shoulder. I can palpate my traps, but it doesn't seem to help. That one can be one that does create a kind of window of relief, not always the
And
long term, but at least in the short term.
if they're having shoulder issues too, it's often that that direct link between the two because the levator can really impede that movement of the shoulder blade that needs to happen in order to have good shoulder movement. So
And this is
it
still
can
something, I know
oftentimes.
you disagree with me, but this is still something that people are saying out in the world, that students must always keep their shoulder blades down or always keep their shoulder blades on their back. Tiffany doesn't believe me. She's like, no one says that anymore. Yes, they do. They really do. So I do think people can get mixed up in their signals when you lift your arm, people. PSA, when you lift your arms overhead, the outer edges of your shoulder blades will also lift. So you can't keep them stuck in your back pockets. You can't keep them anchored down your back. You've got to let at least the outer edges of the shoulder blades sweep up toward the outer armpit to let your arms have their full range of motion. You heard it here.
And
Probably not first, but you heard it here.
I still think there's a place for shoulder blades down. It's just that
Of
we tend to
course.
overdo it. We tend to be like really, and I think sometimes that like stuff them in your back pocket. Sometimes that induces a nice effect for some people who can do that more moderately. But for me, like stuffing them in your back pocket, that's pretty far away. It
Yeah.
for me triggers a more aggressive
Yeah, I
downward
would I
pressing.
would
And
use that in locust when my arms are back behind my body, or arrowhead, leaning crescent
ooh,
when the arms are back behind the body, and I'm saying to people, shoulder blades back and down, and I don't see any movement in their bodies, I'll say, tuck them in your back pockets, shrug them down to your back pockets to really exaggerate that, squeeze them together, take them down toward the back of the waist. So it is a much stronger cue, definitely not one I would use when the arms are overhead.
And it comes back to that finesse, when in the mechanics, right? When I'm abducting the arm, when I'm taking my arms up overhead, I need upward rotation of the scapula, which I'm sure you could Google upward rotation of scapula and kind of get a visual of that. But if you think about the bony, the, the, the process there, the glenoid fossa there, that the head of the humerus that the arm bone sits in, it's like a cup. I'm turning that cup upward, like I could hold some fluid in it. And that's the cup of the scapula. Maybe I'm confusing people more if they're not familiar with those terms, but the scapula, the outer portions of the scapula need to turn upward so that the
Mhm.
arm bone can go upward.
Mm.
And yeah, if I'm really aggressively pinning those shoulder blades down, I'm really just creating more resistance and tension, more resistance to movement, the natural
Mm.
movement of my arms there, um, than
Now,
anything. So
can you overuse the muscles on the side of the neck when your arms are overhead? Sure, absolutely. So there is, as you were saying, there's always some finesse to it. And one of the cues that I learned from you that I love is to let the shoulder blades move and then soften the sides of the neck, or do
mm,
less through the sides of the neck. Or if you're upside down in gravity, like in downward facing dog, drop your head. Little things like that can make the just that subtle difference of, yes, I'm letting my shoulder blade move, but I'm not then creating a whole lot of muscular tension around the sides of the neck to really lift the shoulder blades. I'm just letting the outer edges kind of sweep around the side ribs and not overdoing those troublesome muscles or can be troublesome muscles on the tops of the shoulders, sides of the neck.
Yeah, one cue I like too is like inner edges, and this might land for some people and not for others, but inner edges, especially as the arms are going up, inner edges of the shoulder blades descending, but the outer
Mhm.
edges lifting. So
Yeah, if
it's
you
really
have people
helping
who
to
know a
induce
little
that.
anatomy and you can visualize it, or you've done the whole class on scapular movement, I think that's a beautiful one because that's exactly what you're looking for people to feel.
Yeah, and it's inducing that upward rotation of the scapula, right? As this inner edge comes down, the outer edge goes up. There's that upward rotation of the shoulder blades that happen. You could see that what I was doing if you're watching on YouTube. My palms are my shoulder blades. So the inner edges come down, outer edges come up. And maybe visualize it just in your body there too. It's a less familiar part of the body for a lot of people for the shoulder blades. So, if I mention a complicated cue like that in class, I might say something like, if it lands for you, if it feels meaningful, think about your, inner shoulder blades going down or your outer shoulder and your outer shoulder blades going up so that those who are confused don't feel like, "Ugh, one,
Why can't
totally
I
lost
get
and
this
confused."
yoga thing? People said it would be so relaxing. Oh,
But I think we're alluding to the importance of the shoulder complex when we
yes.
talk about neck issues. And, a lot of times in our trainings, especially the orthopedic ones, we talk a lot about looking upstream, but also looking at, supportive other adjacent tissues or antagonist tissues. And the shoulder's such an important contributor to neck issues. And so looking at shoulder mechanics, and which is again a lot longer story, we talk about in our shoulder module how to evaluate range of motion, function, pain, do an eval, and really strategically work with specific issues there. But if you're familiar with working with shoulders, I think rotator cuff, lats, traps again, serratus, all of these, finding a balance of what do I want to strengthen? What do I want to release? What's working too hard? And, I think in a really simple context, because I like to make this information available to all levels of learning and students and teachers. But, and if you're a student and all this anatomy is just kind of more than you need right now, I think I also think of that in the sense in a yoga class that I'm really leaning into the things that are challenging. So I might go through a wide variety of movements in a yoga class and find that some in particular are really hard for me. And obviously, want to approach those in a way that's not inducing pain, but coming back to those things that are hard, which is the opposite of our human tendency, is kind of like to quickly brush over and go quickly so we don't show a weakness. And same thing with range of motion and tension and releasing the tissues is really kind of just without overthinking it, looking to the areas that are challenging, both in the shoulder and in the neck. Really important.
Yeah, I love that. And you sort of preface that by talking about patterns of muscular imbalance, and that always gets me thinking about posture, which is sort of our most chronic expression of our muscular patterns. So when I think about how the shoulders can be this hidden contributor to neck pain, one area is that overhead arm movement, the shoulder mechanics there. The other big issue is rounded shoulder posture, shoulders drifting. And I feel like I always have to preface this by saying our shoulders are meant to be slightly forward. They aren't meant to be always in our back pockets the way we talked about a moment ago. They are meant to be slightly toward the side ribs because our arms and hands work in front of the body. But when that pattern becomes exaggerated or becomes the only way you can hold your shoulders, then that obviously too is going to have an impact on the neck because the base that the neck sits on is rounding forward toward the front of the body. You tend to get a little bit more rounding through the upper back, the thoracic spine, and that means the neck needs to compensate, and the muscles that hold the head in place are going to have to compensate too. So, what do you think about shoulder posture in the context of neck pain?
Yeah. Well, I definitely think posture in general is really good
Mm,
as I sit up really straight. And, I think posture can get a bad rap sometimes, like,
mhm.
"Oh, we're not designed to live in a straitjacket," and I totally agree. We're not designed to
Same.
live in a straitjacket and be, stiff and upright. However, I am living under gravity, and so that's also influencing the tissues, and if I'm kind of slouching and rounding all day long, it's gonna have a different impact on the tissues than if I'm sitting more upright. Now, yes, like you said, it's not designed to be like shoulders back,
Military.
squeeze
Mm,
them there. But I do want to find a fairly comfortable position, which is going to be a little different person to person, depending on bone structure, somewhat, and soft tissues and sports and all of that, and adaptations within the system. But, I think just trying to have a more upright posture can be really important long term because it's the one thing that we can do for longer periods of time, than maybe even like a short yoga practice. I'm living under gravity all day long potentially. So even just those moments I choose to have a better upright posture, both of the shoulders, but then, I talked about looking upstream. And when we talk about upstream from the neck, what we're talking about really is head posture. So, the weight of that head leaning forward is such a big thing for the neck and everything below it too, the low back too. So also considering, adjusting where my head is in space. And again, for the context of this podcast, try not to overthink that. We can definitely go deep into analysis and we do in our trainings. But we also can just kind of find that plumb line of like where can I position my head where I don't have to work so hard, with there's the least amount of effort. And I'll just say too, one more thing I think with this upstream mentality. One is looking at head position, but I think the other is also looking at our brain, our perspective. And I think
mhm.
a lot of times people with neck pain are always kind of living in the future and looking ahead and maybe worrying and stressing about the future. And so this present moment awareness, this ability to kind of be in our bodies and I think can also be an antidote. Often, not for everyone, everyone's a little different. So you have to like see what resonates with you or your client, but can often be a big thing in neck pain.
Oh, it's all too easy for me to imagine myself at my desk feeling that sense of, nagging neck tension or neck pain and just closing my eyes for a moment and breathing out. And even that just dropped my shoulders onto my back ribs and created a different sense of tension on the muscles. So I think probably everybody would agree that stress comes to mind when you think about neck pain, neck tension. And it really could be as simple as just leaning back a little from worrying about the future or worrying about the deadline or worrying about getting this next thing done and just letting yourself be present now. I mean, and that's such a potent reminder that it isn't all about biomechanical issues and muscular imbalances, and it can really be about much more fundamental kind of psychological stuff too.
Yeah, totally. And I think really anything around stress and nervous system regulation are oftentimes really crucial for neck pain, a
Mm.
really big hidden contributor, like so many other issues we talk about on here and in our trainings. So one of the great things about yoga is that we have so many great ways to regulate the nervous system, depending on what you love, whether you really love and lean into yin or restorative or pranayama or myofascial release. All of these can be, and meditation, all of these can
Yoga
be
nidra.
nervous system regulators, nidra. Yeah. So, like, I always think of what do you like the most? What do you find most relaxing and gravitate toward that. You can learn to like the others. You can learn to then and that can be a helpful tool to regulate the nervous system, to expand that, wheelhouse of nervous system regulators at some point. But, at the beginning is just I think leaning toward the things that are most relaxing to you naturally, which one you gravitate toward. MFR, I think, is often one we forget and one that's such a great nervous system regulator because who doesn't like getting a massage, and we know
Some
the,
people don't,
influence of
but most people do.
yes. We know that the influence of the slow MFR techniques to influence those Ruffini endings and have that impact on the nervous system, that parasympathetic response to be so profound. And again, sometimes more for some people than others. There's always some people that don't like MFR. That's okay. Um, some people don't like it. That's okay.
That said,
Maybe
though,
you'll like it later.
talking about myofascial release in the context of neck pain and neck tension, there are a couple of myofascial release practices that I'm yet to meet someone who doesn't enjoy them, and this is rare for me with MFR. Usually, there's at least 1 or 2 people in a class who are like, "Eh, didn't love that," or "That one wasn't for me," but this one seems pretty universal. So it's having a foam block, a softer foam block, not a cork or wood block, underneath the bottom of the back of the skull. So these are my 2 favorites, either on its flattest height, so you're sitting the occiput, the bony base of the skull, on the lowest height, and then just letting your head get heavy or giving it a little infinity symbol or a little smiling semicircle side to side, or the same thing with the block up on its middle height. Works for some people better than others, just coming down to neck proportions. And these are 2 that people absolutely seem to love. And yet, I often get questions from teachers who are starting to learn about anatomy and posture that say, well, both of those are taking the head into forward posture, moving the head forward of the midline of the body because you're doing them lying on your back. How could that be helpful when that's a pattern that a lot of us are trying to eradicate? And to me, this one comes right back to what you were talking about down regulating the nervous system. It's really less about tension on the muscles, although I'm sure there's some circulation changes going on there and some release of tension going on there. But it's more about giving people a space in which they can just, let their tongue hang out and let their forehead smooth and just really lean into relaxation. That sort of,
Well,
oh.
yeah, I agree, and I also think in that question too, is I also need to consider how my body's relating to gravity.
Of
So not
course.
only am I completely passive, but now gravity is pushing down on the front of my body.
Hmm.
So for someone who has forward head carriage, it's not going to fix their forward head carriage. Obviously, they need to fix their posture. But when we're working on all these suboccipital muscles that get kind of compressed with forward head carriage. So the byproduct of that. And again, we mentioned usually fixing neck pain or any kind of dysfunction in the body isn't a one item story, but really multiple. I need to look at this kind of multifaceted approach of releasing something and maybe strengthening something
Hmm.
and maybe changing posture or perspective or working with the nervous system. I think those are really big ones though. The nervous system one, I think we do our case study calls. So for our 500-hour therapeutic specialist program, they have to do case studies and present them, and I love listening to them because pretty much every time there's always at least a case or two on those calls, or maybe a bunch that we're doing mechanical case studies, so shoulder injuries or hip injuries or spine injuries, and found that the nervous system regulation was actually the most helpful thing. It's not all of them, right? But I think nervous system regulation is always something you can throw in there when you're working with pain as one of those prongs that you're working with, to have that kind of three-dimensional approach because, you know,
We're
how do
whole
you see
people.
nervous system regulation? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So circling back to the postural side, I wanted to talk about a couple of muscles that don't link directly to the neck, but can, in my experience, be influential on what we feel in our neck when we think about those postural patterns of tending to round forward, head drift forward, shoulders drift forward. And that is the rhomboids and middle traps, which draw the shoulder blades closer to the spine, and the shoulder external rotators infraspinatus or infraspinatus for those in North America, and Terry's minor, my apologies, on the back of the shoulder blade, both of which kind of take the shoulders a little closer to the back of the body and open the chest. Now, those muscles don't link directly to the neck. So, in theory, they shouldn't really be implicated in neck tension, but in my experience, they certainly can be from people getting those muscles stronger, or at least strengthening their connections to them and getting them to work a little bit more by default. That can change people's posture, which then changes how their head and neck are positioned in space, and can really help people feel different. Not a quick fix, one of those things that takes a bit of time to develop strength and that pattern, but that can make a difference over time.
Yeah, I think working, and you can also just think, if the anatomy is not as meaningful to you, just thinking about working on that posterior shoulder,
Yeah.
um, and upper back a bit, or maybe even releasing chest and pecs and
Yes.
classes that kind of open the chest. I know on Yoga Medicine Online, I have a bunch for like opening the chest. I also have a bunch for like rotator cuff and posterior shoulder. And if you think about classes that create that chest opening or heart opening, especially more actively, I think passively can be helpful too. But we need that active support for
Mm.
more of the long-term effects. The passive is usually more symptomatic, although I think like we said before, it all kind of goes together and we're kind of trying to look at the person as a whole. So, yeah.
And then I had one more hidden contributor to neck tension, which goes even lower down the body. And I see this in myself when I'm editing my classes for yoga medicine online. And so maybe because of that, I see it in my students too, which is when we are asking the body to do something challenging, something whether it's strength oriented or balance and stability oriented, I'll often see my own neck switch on. And so now I see it in my students too, when really the neck muscles can't help me in floating half moon, or my neck muscles can't really help me in a deep lunge. But I'll see the muscles switch on because it's just part of my programming that when things are difficult, neck help. So that's another, I think, hidden way to work on neck tension is to be more aware of strength and support in your core, your hip muscles, your legs, so that you have this really solid and sturdy foundation, and the upper body can, at least in standing poses, almost float on top. That you are so trusting in your base that you don't have to feel anxious. You don't have to have that, what you were talking about, that forward leaning anxiety about the future. You can just let the upper body rest while the lower body does its job of carrying you competently through the challenges of life.
Well, and I think what we're talking about too is people who tend to overuse their neck.
Yeah,
And let's say
present.
speak about it really generally, like people who tend to hold a lot of tension and stress in their neck. I think most people are a lot of people are aware of that, maybe not everyone. And I think our goal as a yoga teacher is to sometimes point out that. Do you notice that you're clenching, that you're really tensing those muscles of your neck as you do this? And for me, it's more a question of like, obviously, again, if we think about swimming and gravity, like in Half Moon, my lateral neck stabilizers have to engage to hold my head
Sure.
up. Like there is some neck activation. We're not trying to get rid of that completely, but I think sometimes the question is like, do I need am I am I overutilizing those muscles? Do I
Mhm,
need all of that activation? And a teacher can often be a mirror to be like, hey, those muscles we worked on the front of the neck, like can you tell that they're on? And, like, do you need them here? Can you relax them? And that might be a challenge that is, ongoing. It might not be just an instant, like, oh, there it goes, it releases.
mhm,
But it might first just be noticing that they're active all the time or a lot of the time, or that that's your go to place. And then
mhm,
I become more aware of that, maybe even after I leave my mat and kind of noticing those automations. Are they helping? Are they protecting? Are they actually just perpetuating patterns that are not as helpful? And this is where I think yoga becomes so helpful just in that increased body awareness as we start to notice, is this serving me? Is it helping me? I don't
mhm,
need to be an anatomy expert or an expert yoga teacher as a student in a practicing a yoga practitioner to, evaluate and to experiment and to sense, do I need that? Yes, the neck muscles, I think sometimes get a bad rap and we're like, oh, we just have to totally relax them. But they still have to work. And I think putting them under load, under gravity,
for sure.
load meaning like the weight of my head under like Half Moon in a different scenario where I'm providing that stimulus. Isometrics can be a great way to work with them. I have a great video on neck isometrics on Yoga Medicine
Mm,
Online. You can just search neck and isometrics in my classes. Can be a great way to actually challenge those tissues in a healthy way. But ultimately, we're trying to find what's most helpful for that unique individual, which, as we talked about already, is potentially a lot of different things.
mhm. And
Could
sometimes
be
for me, that
releasing.
exploration can have stages. So stage 1 might be, maybe I'm in half moon, but maybe to make it a little bit easier, my legs are in triangle. Can I relax my neck completely? Can I kind of let my head just kind of drop off the top of my spine? And that in itself, for some people, adds significantly to the balance challenge of a pose where they didn't realize how much their neck was working, not to hold the weight of their head, but to keep them steady. And then once you feel, yes, I can keep myself stable with my head relaxed. Okay, now can I turn on the top side of the neck only to lift my head up so that it's neutral in relation to gravity? Could I even rest my fingertips on my ear or cheek or temple and create a little bit of isometric resistance into that? Can I use the muscles there with discernment rather than just having the whole thing come on as a package or switch off as a package? Can I decide? And that's exactly the exploration that you're talking about that we both love so much in the practice of being aware of our programming and starting to play with it a little bit, opening up the user's manual and deciding which steps we want to follow and which we don't. And that to me is the fun part of showing up on my mat with an open mind.
And I think why it's cool as a teacher in a group class to offer different options. It's not that we constantly have to provide new stimulus, but to find different ways to work with tissues, to explore different ways. And it's one of my favorites actually is like triangle or extended side angle. So if I'm in my right side triangle or extended side angle, left arm in a loose half bind and my right ear toward my shoulder, of how can I
Mm,
simultaneously embrace relaxation in my neck and strength and support and stability in my lower body? Can I be actively present in the world and still at ease? To me, those two opposites can coexist. And obviously, it's something we could explore in like yoga nidra or meditation as well. But how do I support those opposites? How do I allow those opposites to coexist? And I think with people who hold a lot of tension in their neck, it can be a really challenging one for me personally that I really love. I really love
love.
those explorations. So
I do too, and you're offering something in a class that is in some ways a pretty isolated experience. Can I relax a little through my neck or even stretch one side of my neck while my legs hold me sturdy? But there are lots of philosophical layers to that that could get you thinking, if that appeals to you in the rest of your life. Where am I holding on too tightly that I could soften and let go? Where are my really strong foundations? Could I trust in them? That's what I love about that kind of practice is you're inviting students into however much inquiry they're interested in, which could just be, can I relax my neck here? Yes, no, or could be, wow, how does this show up in my life? Am I too rigidly trying to hold an outward shape in life? Could I soften my grip on some things and trust in my foundations? Fun.
I love I love that. I love that. And I love where, we get those layers of, nuance that we can add for again, different layers of inquiry if people are interested in it. So we've talked about specifically the neck. We've talked about what can we release, what can we strengthen. I talked about looking upstream at head posture. We talked a lot about posture and perspective as well. We also talked about the shoulder, but I think another one and the nervous system, but I think another one to consider that's really important is the thoracic spine. If the thoracic
Yes.
spine is really locked up, it's going to not only influence the cervical spine, but also the lumbar spine. So you might feel it in one of those places more than the other. So the thoracic spine gets less movement in general, just speaking very generally. We talk about specifics in our course, but no need to dive down that rabbit hole. Um, but the big thing is I want to maintain that because as we all kind of experience as humans living in our bodies, the thoracic spine and this kind of mid back can be an area that gets really, I'll say sticky or
Yeah.
stuck. And especially if you use your upper extremities a lot or if you play a lot of sports, especially, you know, well, even runners
But
that
even if
don't
you
use their arms
don't,
as much,
I
but
feel like the two sides of the spectrum have equal issues with thoracic mobility. People who use their upper body a lot, including, construction workers, hairdressers, all of that sort of stuff, and also people who don't use them at all and just kind of sit at a desk with their fingers on a keyboard. Both sides of the spectrum, same remedy here.
yeah, and postural obviously is going to affect that. So, um, anything passively or actively to mobilize the thoracic spine, myofascial release. We do some specific stuff to mobilize thoracic spine, but a really important area to work on. Again, the specifics are beyond the context of a podcast, but we have so many great moves. If you are on Yoga Medicine Online and you just put thoracic in there and search it on my classes or anyone's classes, you'll find a bunch. I know in mine specifically. And that thoracic mobility, I think, is a really big, really hidden contributor to neck pain. Like we tend to like want to go right for the neck, right for the neck, right for the neck. And for people who
Mhm.
have a lot of pain and irritability, I'll just say irritability in quotes in the neck, um, sometimes it's really important to go indirect before direct. And I think the thoracic spine can be a really helpful place to begin your inquiry for someone who is really sensitive and really having a lot of pain in their neck. It can be a great place to start. And off of that, I think also respiratory function. So I
Mhm.
can look at respiratory mechanism. We talk a lot about this in the pranayama teacher training. Improving respiratory function is a really big one because you can imagine a lot of those accessory breathing respiratory muscles in the neck. If you think about breathing really hard, you might already feel your neck
Yeah,
start to
just
tighten up.
relaxed my scalenes and tried to breathe from my belly then, good reminder.
Yeah, and compensate. So being able to restore proper respiratory function can be a big one. And I'll also add in like one that's kind of somewhat indirect, but I think working with the jaw sometimes, I think that
Mm.
goes along with stress and nervous system and also is very close to the neck. So it ties into a lot of that tension that we hold in the neck. So
I do think that's a really important
shoulder.
place to kind of start wrapping up is before we do a kind of summary and key takeaways is you're absolutely right. For people where there is that high irritability in the neck, it's not always as helpful as you'd think to go straight into deep work for the neck, whether that is strength or stretching. When there is that sense of the tissues there being really prone to like flare-ups or high irritation or intense pain, I agree. Your best bet is often just to leave the neck alone, to find a place where the head and neck are supported and comfortable and work elsewhere. Shoulders, thoracic spine, breathing, stress. Even though the temptation is to go straight to where the flashing red light is, I think more so with the neck, maybe because the muscles there are smaller and more attuned to fine positioning than, big, huge movements like the leg muscles, for example. I've had the same experience of sometimes it is best to leave the head and neck alone for a little while and work slightly more distant, work more subtly, get a little bit more mobility below, unlock some of the patterns, soften some of the rigidity, and then see what comes up. Yeah, I think that's important
And
to spell
sometimes
out.
just some other place. Like I think sometimes just when it's really intense like that, even just working on hips and legs, like
Yeah.
hips can be a very feel good place for a lot of people. So I think, especially with MFR, so I think working on the hips and the lower body can sometimes be a great way to pull some of that tension out. And then I think a lot of the outliers are, things like pain education. We talk about that in our nervous system training. Fear, I think, can be one that kind of guards and protects in the neck, but then also the context that the person's living in. Are there repetitive motions of their work, of their life that they're doing that are contributing? Can I adjust those? Maybe I can't. If it's their work, maybe there's a way to set up their ergonomics at their desk better.
Yeah.
Is it an alignment issue in yoga and something I'm doing a lot? Like, can I improve their shoulder mechanics in something like chaturanga if they
Mhm.
if they do a vinyasa class where they do that a lot? And then even like mechanics in a sport, I think, and that would probably be more up to a coach to help them. But I think we can overuse certain parts of our body by not having great mechanics and whatever that sport might be. And so experimenting with perpetuating factors, that context of what the world that I'm living in and how those perpetuating factors of ergonomics or alignment or mechanics are impacting and perpetuating this cycle of tension and pain. And again, sometimes that might be a perspective change.
Mhm.
Bringing them into the present moment, maybe softening some of that fear and protection, or
Mhm.
educating them around pain. And maybe it is more mechanical. I do think approaching the body more mechanically can also build confidence and allay fear and calm the nervous system. And so, as a yoga teacher, I'm kind of always trying to find like what are they subjectively feels best to them. I might be
Uh-huh.
trying out some of these more mechanical things like MFR or strengthening the posterior shoulder, or maybe also a little bit of nervous system and some cues. And I'm kind of watching what they respond to, and I'm really trying to maximize those, and then eventually expanding and adding in more from there at some point, usually. So
I think we both are on the same page with this one in that completely agnostic will do whatever works, whether it feels logical in my brain or not. And I'm sure I've told this story on the podcast before, but I'll tell it again. A new student came to me with neck pain that was so intense that she was crying. And I was a fairly new teacher, no diagnosis, had no idea what I could do safely. And so I said, "Where are you most comfortable?" She said, lying on my back with a little rolled up towel behind the curve at the back of my neck. I said, great. What are you really missing from your yoga practice? And she said, breathing. And I was like, oh, great. I feel like we can do that safely. So we did some breath work. And I said, what makes you happy? She said, thinking about my daughter. So she lay there with the rolled up towel behind the back of her neck. She took soft, slow, deep breaths and she thought about her beloved daughter. And after 30 minutes, her neck pain had gone down by something like 50%. And I hadn't taught her any yoga at all. In fact, she had decided what she was doing the whole way through. So do whatever works. You don't have to understand why. You're really looking for the button that seems to create the response in yourself or in the student. And that could be, as you were summing up, head position, could be balance in the neck muscles, could be further down, balance in the shoulder and chest and upper back muscles, could be thoracic mobility, could be trust in your core and leg strength, your standing stability, but it could be more subtle. It could be fear or anxiety or stress. It could be your breathing mechanics. So be open, be curious, and use as a compass the things that you feel like you're responding to or your students responding to.
I love that story. That was a great
I
story
love
and
it
a great
too.
way to
It was so powerful for me because I was very biomechanically minded. I'm definitely not pranayama or visualization oriented, even less so then than I am now. So for me, it was a really powerful lesson on the power of the nervous system. Yeah.
And, I think for those of you who practice on our site, and if you don't, you can, what is it, a week or 2 they get free?
Yeah.
I've lost
7 day
track.
free trial.
So a week for free. Um, there you can search pretty much any one of those topics and find. The great news is we have tons and tons of classes on there now. So
Mhm.
you can find classes for all of those things: thoracic, respiratory, jaw. I mean, nervous system, there's load because you could just do all of those categories of MFR,
Stress.
yin, restorative. You could find some on posture, of course, although a lot of them will be speaking to that in many ways. You can find some specifically on neck. You can search neck, you can search shoulder, and you can search stress. You could also search multiple of those, like shoulder, upper back and shoulder, you
Mhm.
know, upper
Head
back.
and
I know I have a
neck.
bunch on scapula function,
Uh-huh.
and I know I have a bunch specifically for neck, like some quick fixes if people need a quick fix. I have my neck fix class and one that's called regulate neck pain, which are all really great for more of like a quick fix. And then a longer one that uses isometrics. So neck resilience isometrics. And it's also prep for headstand, which you don't have to do. If you're in pain, obviously it wouldn't be the best thing, but I go through isometrics, which can be a great way to help neutralize pain in the beginning of that practice. And again, if you search my classes in neck, you'll find quite a bit. You could also search our other teachers and find quite a bit. One of my favorites too, my fast track to Zen, is one that shows a little cradle for the neck, which I really love and find to be really relaxing for people who have a hard time to relax, and a really unique one. You don't really see much. But yeah, there's pretty much everything you can find on there. If you are interested in exploring any one of those topics, search it. You will find some things. You
Mm.
might also kind of distill it down by searching by length or style or other categories as well. So,
And we'll also
and I
link
know you have
to
a
all the
bunch.
teacher trainings we've mentioned as well, because we've talked about the spine training, obviously for the neck and for the thoracic mobility. You'll learn a lot more in that training, the shoulder training, and kind of getting to know that more secret, less well understood part of the body can be a game changer for a lot of people, for posture, for breathing mechanics, for neck pain, as well as for weight bearing strength in practices like vinyasa yoga. We also talked about the nervous system training, and we also talked about the pranayama training. So we've got you
And
covered no matter
MFR.
what you want to do. And MFR.
Yeah.
Just go
Yeah.
to the website. That'll be
You
quicker.
know, and I will say, with our trainings, we dive in really deep on each
Mm,
subject, and so you'll learn a lot of information. You'll have a lot to take home. Don't feel like you have to go through all of those trainings to be a resource to your teachers, but start with the one that feels the most helpful and interesting to you. Go really deep in that subject
mm,
matter and start experimenting with it and using it. And then, the great thing about being a teacher is there's no end to our learning. We're always going to be learning for the rest of our lives. Hopefully, I think, as soon as we shut ourselves up to learning is when we start to get kind of stagnant and
mm.
maybe a little bored. And burn out with our jobs. So, it's a constant learning process, and you don't need to be in a hurry to do that. But when you're ready, they're always there. And for those of you who are more students, and I think as teachers, we're also students, of course, and want practices. We have a lot on our site. I know you have some neck ones too, I'm sure.
I do indeed. Yeah, I have an MFR and Yin class if you're looking for something more chilled out called Neck, Shoulder, and Upper Back Favorites. My favorites and my students' favorites. There's one called Mobilize Your Shoulders, Release Your Neck, and this is more active. This is for people like me who find that their neck tends to just kind of lock up when they're in a stronger practice. And then finally, in my spine series, I've got one on head and neck awareness to get you more focused on what your head is doing when you're in default mode, when you're balancing or in standing poses or moving, and you kind of forget to think about posture. Because posture, I think, can become this static thing that we forget when we're moving. So I'll link to those three too for those of you who are keen.
So lots of great resources. And of
Mm.
course, you can just start with what's in this podcast. We have just downloaded a ton of information on you of things you can work with neck issues, hidden contributors. So start with that. Don't feel like you need a lot. But those are a lot of resources for your own practice, for your own learning. If and when you want to dive a little deeper, we're here for you. This was great. Thank you. This was Rachel's idea. Great topic. Thank you for bringing it, Rachel. And
Fun.
we look forward to the next one. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let us know in the comments if you like it. The best way you can support us is to give a 5-star rating, and we'll see you for the next one.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.